I always believed the funeral would be the worst day of my life, until I went home 48 hours later and found my key wouldn't turn. My older sister didn't just change the locks. She handed me a notice claiming I was a temporary occupant in the house where I grew up. It took me 5 years to stop shaking. But today, looking at the documents she thought I'd never find, I finally understand exactly how she did it. The silence in the house after a funeral is supposed to be heavy, but it is supposed to be yours. It is supposed to be a space where you can sit with the ghost of the life you just lost, surrounded by the objects that made that life real. I expected the silence. I expected the grief that felt like wet wool wrapped around my lungs. What I did not expect was the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place against me, locking me out of the only home I had ever known, 48 hours after we put our mother in the ground. My name is Lydia Wood, and at 33 years old, I had become an orphan twice over in the span of 4 months. My father went first, a sudden heart attack that dropped him in the driveway while he was washing the Buick. It was violent and quick, the kind of death that leaves a scorch mark on the pavement. My mother, who had been drifting into the fog of early dementia for a year, simply unraveled in the wake of his absence. She followed him with a terrifying rapidity, her body forgetting how to work, just as her mind forgot how to stay present. By the time the second funeral arrived, I was not crying. I was functioning on a biological autopilot, a numbness that felt less like peace and more like shock. I stood by the graveside, watching the dark earth pile up, and felt a hand on my elbow. It was my older sister, Elena. She was 38, 5 years my senior, and she looked impeccable. While my black dress was rumpled from 3 days of sitting in hospice chairs, Elena looked like she had been ironed into existence. Her hair was a sleek helmet of blonde, her sunglasses large enough to hide any evidence of tears. Though I had not seen her shed many. "You hold it together, Lydia," she whispered, squeezing my arm just hard enough to bruise. "We have to look strong for the relatives." I nodded. I always nodded, for as long as I could remember. Elena was the manager of the Wood family, and I was the staff. She was the one who knew where the birth certificates were kept. She was the one who spoke to the doctors. During those last chaotic months, I had been the nurse, the one changing sheets, spoon-feeding broth, sleeping on the floor next to Mom's bed. But Elena had been the administrator. She handled the appointments, the insurance, the pharmacy runs. I was grateful for it then. I thought we were a team, one heart, one brain. The reception was held at a rented community hall because the house, our parents' house, was too full of medical equipment and sorrow. The air smelled of stale coffee and lilies, a scent that now makes my stomach turn. I sat in a folding chair, staring at a plate of untouched egg salad, while Elena moved through the room like a shark in dark water. She was efficient, terrifyingly so. I watched her intercept the funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Henderson, before he could reach me. She spoke to him in low, clipped tones, handing him an envelope. She collected the condolence cards from the basket near the door, stacking them into her oversized tote bag before anyone else could touch them. When she finally sat next to me, she didn't ask how I was doing. She pulled a manila folder from that same bag. "Lydia, I need you to sign these," she said. Her voice was flat, practical. I blinked at her, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep. "What is it?" "Administrative paperwork," she said, uncapping a pen and pressing it into my hand. "For the bank. They need to freeze the account so the bills do not bounce. We do not want the power turned off at the house while we figure things out." I looked down at the paper. The text was dense, single-spaced, a wall of legalese that swam before my tired eyes. I saw the word estate and the word waiver, but my brain refused to process the context. I looked at Elena. She was my big sister. She had just buried our parents too. The idea that she would be doing anything other than trying to keep the lights on seemed impossible. "Where do I sign?" I asked. She pointed to a line at the bottom, marked with a sticky tab. "Right there. And here." I signed. I signed my name in blue ink, the loops of the L and the Y shaky, barely resembling the signature on my driver's license. Elena took the papers back immediately, sliding them into the folder and snapping the bag shut. "Good," she said. "Go eat something. You look terrible." That was the last time she spoke to me for 2 days. I spent the next 48 hours at my own apartment, a small studio 20 minutes away, trying to sleep and failing. I needed to go back to the house. I had left my good coat there, along with my laptop and, more importantly, the box of photos I had pulled out to make the funeral collage. I also wanted Mom's recipe box. It was a silly thing to fixate on. But the thought of that wooden box, smelling of cinnamon and old index cards, felt like the only anchor I had left. I drove over on a Tuesday morning. The street was quiet, the suburban lawns manicured and indifferent to my tragedy. I pulled into the driveway, behind Elena's SUV. I was surprised to see her there. I thought she had gone back to her own house in the next county. I walked up the front steps, digging for my keys. I slid my key into the lock and tried to turn it. It stuck. I frowned, jiggling it. I pulled it out, wiped it on my jeans, and tried again. It would not turn. It felt like the wrong key. Then the door opened. Elena stood there. She was not wearing black anymore. She was wearing a crisp white blouse and jeans, looking ready for a brunch or a board meeting. She did not step back to let me in. She stood directly in the threshold, her hand on the frame, blocking the way. "Elena," I said, holding up my key. "The lock is jammed." "It is not jammed." "Lydia," she said. "I changed it." My brain stuttered. "You what?" "I changed the locks," she repeated. She spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "Security reasons. The house is vacant now. We cannot have people just coming and going. I am not people," I said, a nervous laugh bubbling up in my throat. "I am your sister. I live here. Well, I practically lived here for 6 months taking care of Mom. My stuff is inside." Elena crossed her arms. Her face was a mask of calm, polished porcelain. It was a look I recognized from when we were teenagers, the look she gave me right before she told on me for something she had done herself. "You do not live here. Lydia, you have an apartment, and the house is in my name now." The world tilted slightly to the left. "What are you talking about? It is Mom and Dad's house. It is in my name," she said again. "Dad transferred the deed before he died. To simplify things, you are not on the deed. Lydia, you have no legal right to enter this property." I stared at her. This had to be a joke, a cruel, stress-induced joke. "Elena, stop it. Let me in. I need my laptop. I need the photo albums." She reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to me. I unfolded it. At the top, in bold, ugly font, was the logo for something called Vantage Estate Services. Below that, the words, "Notice to vacate." To Lydia Wood, "You are hereby notified that your status as a temporary guest at the premises is terminated effective immediately. This property is under the management of the sole owner. Due to safety concerns regarding the securing of the estate, no unauthorized entry is permitted." "Safety concerns?" I whispered. Elena smiled. But it did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were dead things. "We have to be careful. The house needs to be inventoried for probate. We cannot have items disappearing." "Disappearing?" I shouted, my voice finally breaking the quiet of the neighborhood. "I am not a thief. I want Mom's recipe box. I want Dad's watch." "Inventoried," Elena said smoothly. "Everything is being cataloged. If you are entitled to anything in the will, you will get it in due time. But for now, you need to leave. If you try to force entry, I will call the police." I looked past her, over her shoulder into the hallway. The house looked different. The rug was gone. And then I saw them. Cardboard boxes. They were stacked against the wall near the staircase. They were brown, uniform, and taped shut. They were labeled in thick black marker. Kitchen/fragile. Linens. Donate. They were not just packed. They were ready. "You packed," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the gut. "You packed the house already?" The funeral was 2 days ago. Elena stepped back and began to close the door. Go home. Lydia, this is for the best. Elena! I lunged forward, jamming my foot in the door. She shoved me. It was not a gentle push. She placed both hands on my shoulders and shoved me backward with enough force that I stumbled down the porch steps, catching myself on the railing before I hit the concrete. The door slammed. The deadbolt clicked. I stood there for a long time, clutching the eviction notice, listening to the silence of the house that was no longer mine. I did not go to my apartment. I could not bear to be alone. I drove to the house of Mrs. Gable, a woman who had been my mother's best friend since high school. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without a word. I sat on her floral sofa, drinking sweet tea I did not want, and told her everything. I showed her the letter. This is not right, Mrs. Gable said, reading the notice with trembling hands. Your parents would never do this. Your mother told me just last year that the house was for both of you. She wanted you to sell it and split the money, or for one of you to buy the other out. Elena says she has a deed, I said, my voice sounding hollow. She says Dad signed it. Mrs. Gable shook her head. Your father was confused at the end. Lydia, you know that. The medication, the oxygen levels. That night, Mrs. Gable made up the guest bed for me. I lay in the dark, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling shadows, and replayed the funeral reception in my mind. I saw Elena's hand on my shoulder. I saw the pen. I saw the stack of papers. Administrative paperwork. For the bank. What did I sign? The question gnawed at me. A rat chewing through a wire. I had signed without reading. I had trusted her because she was my sister, and because grief makes you stupid. It makes you docile. The next morning, I did not go to work. I called in sick, my voice shaking so badly my boss did not even ask for details. Instead, I drove to the county courthouse. The probate clerk's office was in the basement, a room that smelled of old toner and dust. I waited in line for 40 minutes, clutching my purse like a shield. When I finally reached the counter, the clerk, a woman with kind eyes and bright red lipstick, asked how she could help. I need to check on an estate filing, I said, for Arthur and Mary Wood. She typed into her computer, the keys clacking loudly in the quiet room. Here it is, she said, filed 3 days ago. Fast work. 3 days ago? That was the day of the funeral. Who is the representative? I asked. Elena Miller, the clerk read. Personal representative. Looks like she was appointed immediately. There is a waiver here from the other heir. Lydia Wood? My stomach dropped. I did not waive anything. It says here you waived your right to notice and your right to contest the appointment. The clerk said, turning the monitor slightly so I could see. She pointed to a scanned document. I leaned in. It was the paper I had signed at the reception. The one she said was for the bank. That is my signature, I whispered, but she told me it was for the utilities. The clerk pulled the monitor back. Her expression softened into pity, the kind that made me want to scream. Honey, you should never sign anything you have not read. Is there a will? I asked. The clerk nodded. It is a pour-over will. Everything goes to the Wood family trust. But if the house was deeded out before death, it is not part of the probate estate anyway. It belongs to whoever is on the deed. I walked out of the courthouse feeling lightheaded. The air outside was hot and humid, but I was freezing. I found a legal aid clinic 3 blocks away. I did not have money for a retainer. My job as a library assistant barely covered my rent and student loans. But the sign said, free consultation. I met with a lawyer named Mr. Alvarez. He was young, with coffee stains on his tie and a desk buried under mountains of files. He listened to me for 20 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, he sighed and leaned back. Lydia, I am going to be honest with you, he said. This is a classic scenario. Grief is the shark-infested water. And unfortunately, sometimes family members are the sharks. Can we undo it? I asked. He rubbed his temples. Maybe. But it is hard. If she has a signed deed and a signed waiver, the burden of proof is on you to prove fraud or coercion. And proving coercion on a waiver you signed in front of witnesses, even if they were distracted, is an uphill battle. He wrote a list on a yellow legal pad and tore the sheet off. "Here is what you do," he said. "First, request certified copies of everything filed in the probate case. Second, freeze your credit, just in case she has access to your personal information. Third, document the lockout. Take pictures of the changed locks. Save that letter she gave you. Do not communicate with her over the phone. Email or text only. So there is a paper trail." I took the list. My hand was shaking. "Mr. Alvarez looked at me. "Listen to me. You are not stupid. You were grieving. Predators look for the limp. It is not your fault." I left his office with the yellow paper folded in my pocket. I sat in my car, the engine cold, and pulled out my phone. I wanted to look at the picture I had taken of the flowers at the funeral, just to remind myself that the day had been real, that my parents were really gone. I scrolled back to the photos from the reception. There was one accidental shot, taken when I was putting my phone down on the table to pick up a napkin. It was blurry, angled sideways. It showed the edge of the table, a half-eaten sandwich, and Elena's open tote bag on the chair next to me. I zoomed in, inside the bag. Sticking out of the manila folder was a document. The focus was soft, but the lighting from the overhead fluorescent bulbs was harsh enough to catch the text. I pinched the screen, expanding the image until the pixels blurred. I could see the top of a document. It did not say bank authorization. I could make out the words, "Quitclaim deed," and below that, in the corner where the county recorder stamps their tracking numbers, I saw a faint, blurry string of digits. I stared at the image until my eyes watered. She had the deed at the funeral. She had brought the paperwork to steal the house to the reception where we were eating egg salad in honor of our dead mother. A cold clarity washed over me. It replaced the numbness. It replaced the shock. Elena thought she had won. She thought I was the weak little sister, the one who cried over dead birds, the one who would sign whatever she was told to sign because I wanted to be helpful. She thought I would go back to my rented room, cry for a few months, and eventually accept that this was just how things were. She was right about one thing. I was going to go back to my rented room, but I was not going to accept anything. I started the car. I did not drive to the house to bang on the door. I did not call Elena to scream at her. That was what the old Lydia would have done. Begged for an explanation. Pleaded for fairness. The new Lydia. The one born in the cold shadow of a locked door. Put the car in gear and drove toward the library. I had a job to keep. I had a paycheck to earn. And I had a list from Mr. Alvarez. I was not going to fight her for the house. Not yet. I was going to fight her for the truth. I was going to find out exactly how she did it. Piece by piece, paper by paper. I would be quiet. I would be patient. I would be the ghost she thought she had already exorcised. I pulled into traffic, my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in days. You want to play administrative games. Elena? I thought. Okay, let's look at the paperwork. My new life cost $750 a month, which bought me a room in a basement apartment in North Hollow. A neighborhood that sat on the weary edge of the city. The room had one window, a narrow rectangle high up on the wall that looked out onto the tires of parked cars. The floor was covered in beige carpet that smelled faintly of damp wool and someone else's cigarettes. It was a steep drop from the oak floors and sunlight of the house I grew up in. But it was mine. I moved in 2 weeks after the locks were changed. I did not have much to unpack, just the clothes I had in my car and the few boxes I had retrieved from my own apartment before breaking my lease to save money. I set up my bed, a secondhand frame I found online, and placed the photo of my parents on the nightstand. It was the only picture I had. The rest were hostage in the house on Elm Street, presumably sitting in those brown cardboard boxes marked for inventory. I kept my job at the library, but just barely. My boss, Mrs. Gable, watched me with a mixture of pity and concern that made my skin itch. I showed up on time. I shelved the books. I helped patrons find the tax forms, but I was hollowed out. I felt like a husk of a person, walking through the motions of living while my mind was stuck on a loop of that Tuesday morning on the porch. I started seeing a therapist named Doctor, Evans. I did not go because I felt broken, though I certainly felt brittle. I went because I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the eviction notice. I saw Elena's face, smooth and unbothered, telling me I was a temporary occupant. The rage that woke me up at 3 a.m. was not hot. It was cold and sharp, like a piece of glass in my chest. I am not here to talk about my childhood. I told Dr. Evans in our first session, I am here because I need to learn how to turn my brain off so I can go to work. Dr. Evans, a woman with gray curls and patience that seemed geological in scale, nodded. You are grieving, Lydia, and you have experienced a trauma regarding your home. It is natural to feel unsafe. It is not just a feeling. I said, it is a fact. My home was stolen. Dr. Evans did not argue with me. She taught me breathing exercises I did not do and gave me permission to be angry, which I did not need. What I needed was evidence. The first step was the paperwork. Mr. Alvarez, the legal aid attorney, had told me to get certified copies of everything. On a Tuesday morning, I took a half-day off work and went back to the county recorder's office. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-grade headache frequency. I filled out the request forms, paid the fees, and waited while the clerk, a man who looked like he had been stamping papers since the Nixon administration, disappeared into the back. He returned with a thick envelope. I sat on a wooden bench in the hallway, the marble floor echoing with the footsteps of lawyers and citizens, and opened the envelope. The first document was the death certificate for my father, Arthur James Wood. Cause of death: myocardial infarction. Seeing it in print made my throat tight, but I pushed past the grief. I flipped the page, and there it was. Quitclaim deed. My breath caught. I read the date at the top, October 12th. My father died on October 15th, 3 days. The deed was signed and notarized 3 days before he died. I stared at the signatures at the bottom. Arthur Wood. Mary Wood. The ink was black. The lines were shaky. My father's signature, usually a bold, sweeping scrawl, looked cramped, the A trailing off into a jagged line. My mother's signature was worse. Small, tremulous, barely legible. Grantor: Arthur and Mary Wood. Grantee: Elena Miller. A single woman. There was no mention of me, no mention of a trust, just a direct transfer of the property, free and clear, to my sister. I closed my eyes and let the memory of that week wash over me. October 12th. That was a Thursday. Dad had been home from the hospital for 2 days after a scare with his blood pressure. He was on new medication, heavy beta blockers and painkillers for his back, which had been flaring up. He spent most of those days in the recliner, dozing, waking up confused about what time it was. And Mom? Mom was in the thick of a bad decline. She had been asking for her own mother, who had been dead for 20 years. I had been working that Thursday. I remembered calling Elena on my lunch break. How are they? I had asked. They are resting, Elena had said. Her voice had been calm. I am handling everything. I have a few appointments to run them to. But you do not need to come over. Save your energy for the weekend. I have a few appointments to run them to. I had thought she meant the cardiologist. I had thought she meant the pharmacy. I looked at the deed again. It was notarized by someone named Timothy P. Clark. The stamp listed an address on 4th Street. A subtle dread began to pool in my stomach. It was not the hot flare of anger anymore. It was something heavier. It was the realization that while I was worrying about Dad's oxygen levels and Mom's confusion, Elena was driving them to a notary to sign away their biggest asset. She had engineered the timing perfectly. She waited until they were weak enough to be compliant, but still alive enough to hold a pen. I left the courthouse and drove straight to 4th Street. The address on the notary stamp belonged to a generic shipping and printing store called Ship It Quick. It was sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a vape shop. The windows were plastered with posters for passport photos and shredding services. I walked in. The bell above the door jingled. The air smelled of packing tape and cardboard. A young man was behind the counter, scrolling on his phone. He looked up, bored. "Can I help you?" I pulled the copy of the deed from my bag. "I am looking for Timothy Clark." I said, "That is me," he said. I placed the document on the counter. "You notarized this," I said, "a few months ago, in October." He glanced at it, then at me. "I notarize 50 things a week, lady. I do not remember every single one." I pulled out my phone and opened a picture of my parents. It was from the previous Christmas. They looked frail but happy, sitting on the sofa. "These are my parents," I said. "They are both dead now." This document gave their house to my sister 3 days before my father died. I just need to know if you remember them coming in. The clerk looked at the photo, then at the deed. His expression shifted from boredom to discomfort. He looked at the date on the paper. "October," he muttered. He looked at me, then back at the photo. "Yeah, I remember them." "You do?" "Yeah. Because of the daughter, the blonde one, Elena." "What about her?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "She was intense," he said. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, usually when old folks come in to sign heavy stuff like deeds, they are chatting, or at least they know what is happening. This lady, she had a whole stack of papers. She was turning the pages for them, pointing at the lines, saying sign here, sign here. She was moving fast. Did my parents say anything?" I asked. "The old man, your dad, he asked once if this was for the insurance." My stomach turned over. "What did she say?" "She said yes." The clerk said, "She said, yes, Dad. It is part of the asset protection plan for the insurance. Just sign it so we can go get lunch." I felt the blood drain from my face. Asset protection, insurance, words that sound safe to an old man who is terrified of leaving his wife with nothing. And my mother? She just stared at the wall. He said, "She signed where the daughter put the pen," but she did not say a word. I took a deep breath. "Thank you," I said. I walked out of the store and sat in my car for 10 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. I could see it. I could see Elena, in her sharp blazer, guiding my confused father and my dementia-ridden mother into that fluorescent-lit shop, lying to their faces while they signed away the only thing they had of value. It was not just theft, it was betrayal. It was using their trust against them. I drove back to my rented room, but I did not stop investigating. The deed was the weapon, but I needed to know the motive. Why the rush? Why 3 days before he died? Had she known he was dying? I went back to the paperwork. I spread the certified copies out on my cheap particle board desk. I had the deed. I had the probate filings. But there was something else in the index the clerk had given me. A reference to a lien. I looked up the document number on the county website. Deed of trust. Grantor. Elena Miller. Grantee. Cedar Valley Lending. LLC. Amount. $50,000. The date was October 16th. The day after Dad died. I stared at the screen. Elena had transferred the house to herself on the 12th. Dad died on the 15th. On the 16th, before we had even picked out a casket, before the obituary was written, she had taken out a loan against the house for $50,000. Cedar Valley Lending. I had never heard of them. My parents did not believe in private lenders. They banked with the same credit union for 40 years. Why would Elena need $50,000 instantly? And why from a place that sounded like a payday loan operation for real estate? I searched for Cedar Valley Lending. The address was a post office box in a neighboring city. No website, no phone number listed in the main directory, just a filing with the Secretary of State showing it had been incorporated 6 months ago. I wrote the name down in a notebook. Cedar Valley Lending, $50,000. October 16th. It felt dirty. It felt like I was digging through a trash can, finding rot beneath the surface. My sister had not just taken the house, she had immediately monetized it. While I was crying over Dad's body at the hospital, she was signing loan documents. I closed the laptop and tried to sleep, but the anger was a living thing in the room with me. 2 days later, the anger turned into humiliation. I was on my lunch break at the library. scrolling through social media on my phone, a bad habit I was trying to break. I saw a notification that a cousin from Ohio had commented on a photo. I clicked it. It was a photo Elena had posted. She was standing on the front porch of our parents' house. Her house now. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater, holding a mug of coffee with both hands, looking wistfully off into the distance. The morning light hit the freshly painted front door, which was now a trendy slate blue instead of the classic red my father had loved. The caption read, "New chapters are hard, but so beautiful. Grateful for this space to heal and grow. Home fresh. Start blessed." I almost threw my phone across the break room. Grateful for this space, the space she stole, the space she kicked me out of. I read the comments. "So brave of you. Elena, your parents would be so proud you are keeping the home alive. Beautiful photo. Sweetie." They did not know. None of them knew. They thought she was the dutiful daughter keeping the family flame burning. They did not know about the locks, the eviction notice, the lies to the old man in the shipping store. I wanted to comment. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to type, "She stole this house. She lied to our dying father. She kicked me out 2 days after the funeral." But I didn't. Mr. Alvarez's voice echoed in my head. "Do not engage emotionally. Build the file." If I commented, I would look like the crazy, jealous sister. I would look unstable. Elena would reply with something gracious and condescending, like, "I know you are hurting. Lydia, please call me if you need help." She would win the public perception war because she was already controlling the narrative. I blocked her. It was a small, petty act of self-preservation, but it felt necessary. I could not watch her perform her grief for likes while I was living in a basement. I shut off my phone and went back to the stacks. I shelved biographies for 2 hours, slamming the books onto the metal shelves a little harder than necessary. The following Saturday, I made a mistake, or maybe it was a breakthrough. I was searching online for the name of the property management company Elena had used on the eviction notice, Vantage Estate Services. It turned out to be a ghost. No website, no office, just a registered agent address that matched a UPS store 3 towns over. But in my searching, I stumbled across a listing for a local auction house, estate of A&M, wood, fine furnishings, jewelry, and collectibles. My heart stopped. The auction was scheduled for that morning at 10 o'clock. It was 9:30. I drove like a maniac to the auction house, a drafty warehouse in the industrial district. The parking lot was full of trucks and vans. I ran inside, flashing my ID to get a bitter paddle I had no intention of using. The room was packed with dealers, collectors, and people looking for a bargain. The air smelled of dust and old varnish. I walked through the rows of tables, my chest tight. There they were, my mother's china cabinet, the dining room table where we had eaten Thanksgiving dinner for 30 years, my father's collection of vintage maps, and then I saw it, Lot 402. It was a small velvet box inside a glass display case, my mother's wedding ring, the gold band with the 3 small diamonds. She had worn it every day of her life until her fingers swelled in the last few months. It was listed as vintage gold and diamond ring. Starting bid, $200. $200. My mother's 50-year marriage was being sold for $200. I looked around frantically. I saw the lamp from the living room, the Tiffany-style one Dad had bought Mom for their 25th anniversary. It was sitting on a table next to a box of mismatched kitchenware, inventoried for probate. That is what Elena had said. We cannot have items disappearing. She wasn't protecting them. She was liquidating them. She was turning our memories into cash as fast as she could. I felt a hand on my arm. "Excuse me. Miss, are you bidding on the lamp?" I turned to see a woman in a heavy coat. "No," I whispered. "That is my mother's lamp." The woman looked at me, confused. "Oh, well, it is a nice piece. I had to leave. I could not watch strangers buy my family's history." I ran to my car and sat there, shaking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to the house and break a window, but I forced myself to breathe. Evidence. This was evidence. I took a picture of the auction catalog. I circled the items. I wrote down the date. This proved that the inventory was a lie. It proved that she was selling estate assets before probate was even closed, which was illegal if she wasn't using the money to pay estate debts. And since she had that $50,000 loan, she didn't need to sell Mom's ring to pay the electric bill. This was greed, pure and simple. I drove back to the old neighborhood that afternoon. I parked 2 streets over and walked, keeping my head down. I wanted to see the house, but I didn't want Elena to see me. I walked past the familiar lawns, the trees I had climbed as a child. When I got close to the house, I saw a truck in the driveway, not Elena's, a contractor's truck. I stopped. A man was walking around the side of the house with a clipboard. I recognized the neighbor working in the yard next door. Mr. Abernathy. He was 70 years old, a retired engineer who measured his grass height with a ruler. He had known my parents since I was born. Mr. Abernathy? I called out softly. He looked up, squinting through his thick glasses. Lydia? Is that you? I walked over to the fence. Hi. Mr. Abernathy. He wiped his hands on a rag. I haven't seen you since the funeral. I was sorry to hear about everything. Thank you, I said. I nodded toward my parents' house. Do you know what is going on over there? He frowned. Lots of activity. Your sister has been busy. New roof coming, I think, and they were doing something with the property line. Property line? I asked. Yeah, surveyors. They were out there a while back. Measuring the back fence? When was that? I asked. He scratched his chin. Oh, must have been September, maybe late August. It was hot. I remember because I went out to ask them if they were going to dig near my hydrangeas. September. My father died in October. You are sure it was September? I asked, my pulse quickening. Positive, he said. It was before your dad went into the hospital the last time. Your sister was out there with them, pointing out the stakes. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Elena had surveyors measuring the property line a month before Dad died. She wasn't just reacting to his death. She had been planning to take the house while he was still eating breakfast in the kitchen. She was preparing the asset for sale or development before she even owned it. This wasn't just an opportunistic grab. This was a long con. Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. I said, that is really helpful. He looked at me closely. You doing okay? Lydia? You look a little thin. I am fine. I lied. Just busy. I walked back to my car, my mind racing. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was monstrous. The deed, the loan, the auction, the surveyors. I needed to confront her, not to scream, but to see. I needed to look her in the eye and see if there was anything left of my sister in there, or if she was entirely gone. I texted her. I need to pick up my mail. I will be there in an hour. She replied instantly. I will leave it on the porch. I need to talk to you. Elena, 5 minutes. She didn't reply. I drove to the house. When I pulled up, she was waiting on the porch. She looked impatient, checking her watch. I walked up the steps. The locks were new, shiny brass that looked out of place. Here is your mail, she said, pointing to a small stack of envelopes on the swing. It is mostly junk. I didn't look at the mail. I looked at her. I went to the records office. Elena, I said quietly. Her face didn't move. A muscle in her jaw jumped. But that was it. And, she said, I saw the deed. You had them sign it 3 days before Dad died. She crossed her arms. So? It was what they wanted, was it? I asked. Or was it what you wanted? Mr. Abernathy told me you had surveyors here in September. Why were you measuring the land while Dad was still alive? She sighed, a sound of supreme annoyance. You are being paranoid. Lydia, I was helping them manage the estate. They knew they were declining. They wanted to make sure the house didn't get tied up in court. So you took it all? I asked. You didn't think to include me? She looked at me then. Really looked at me. Her eyes were cold, like smooth stones from a river bottom. Lydia, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, you need to grow up. You were always the baby. You were always the one who needed help. Mom and Dad knew that. They knew you couldn't handle a property like this. They knew you would just sell it and waste the money. I looked at the auction catalog in my bag. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I wouldn't have sold Mom's ring for $200, I said. She stiffened. That is none of your business. I am managing the assets. You are stealing the assets, I said. She stepped closer to me. She was taller than me, and she used it. Listen to me, she hissed. You always wanted Mom and Dad to choose you. You wanted to be the favorite because you were the one who sat by the bed and held their hands. But they didn't choose you. They chose me. Because I am the one who gets things done. The words hit me like a physical slap. They didn't choose you. It was the lie she used to justify everything. She had convinced herself that her ruthlessness was actually competence, and that my empathy was weakness. I looked at her, standing there in the house our father built, wearing clothes bought with the money from our mother's jewelry. I didn't say anything else. I realized, in that moment, that there was no point. She believed her own story. She had rewritten history to make herself the hero and me the burden. I picked up my mail. Okay, Elena, I said. She looked surprised. She had expected a fight. She had expected tears. Okay, she repeated. I turned and walked down the steps. I didn't look back. I got into my car and locked the doors. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. She was right about one thing. I had wanted them to choose me. But she was wrong about everything else. I wasn't going to ask her for the truth anymore. She didn't have it. I drove back to my apartment, sat down at my desk, and opened a new file folder. I labeled it Timeline. I picked up the certified copy of the deed and placed it inside. I added the printout of the lien. I added the photo of the auction catalog. I wrote down Mr. Abernathy's statement about the surveyors. The war wasn't going to be fought on her front porch. It wasn't going to be fought with screaming matches or tearful pleas. It was going to be fought here, in the quiet of my rented room, with paper. She thought she was the one who got things done. She was about to find out that I was the one who kept the receipts. I picked up my pen and wrote the next item on my list. Check Planning Commission records. If she was surveying the land, she wasn't just selling the house, she was developing it. And if she was developing it, there was a paper trail. I was going to follow it to the end of the earth. The seasons changed, and with them, the sharp edge of my grief began to dull into a heavy, constant ache. Winter turned into a wet, gray spring, and I found a rhythm in my new life that looked, from the outside, like stability. I was no longer the woman who wept in the break room. I was Lydia Wood, the reliable library assistant who always arrived 10 minutes early and never let her personal life bleed onto the circulation desk. I had saved $3,000 in an emergency fund, a number that felt astronomical compared to the zero I had started with. I had found a coffee shop that made a decent bagel, a laundromat where the machines didn't tear my clothes, and a small circle of friends who knew enough to be kind but not enough to be intrusive. There was Sarah, a teacher I met at a book club, and Mark, a barista who slipped me free pastries on Tuesdays. They knew my parents had died. They knew I was estranged from my sister, but they didn't ask why I didn't just go home. I had explained it once, over drinks, with a brevity that discouraged follow-up questions. It is complicated. I had said, probate is a mess. That was the code. People understood probate is a mess. It was a universal shorthand for family dysfunction that allowed everyone to nod sympathetically and change the subject. But while my surface life stabilized, my nights were consumed by a quiet, obsessive war. My bedroom in the basement apartment had become a command center. I had bought a second-hand filing cabinet and a corkboard. The timeline I had started in a notebook was now a sprawling map of dates, documents, and names, connected by pushpins and string like something out of a detective show. I knew I needed professional help, but I couldn't afford a retainer for a high-powered litigator. I did some research and found a lawyer named Mr. Henderson who offered unbundled legal services, limited scope representation where I did the legwork, and he provided the strategy. He was a weary man with an office that smelled of peppermint tea and old carpet. I laid out my timeline for him. The deed signed 3 days before death. The immediate loan, the lockout, the auction. He listened, nodding slowly, tapping a pen against his chin. When I finished, he leaned forward and gave me the news I had been dreading. Lydia. I believe you, he said. It smells terrible. The timing is predatory. The secrecy is classic manipulation. But here is the hard reality. He held up a finger. 1. A deed is a powerful instrument. Unless we can prove your father lacked capacity, meaning he didn't know what he was signing, or that he was under extreme duress, the deed stands, and proving incapacity is difficult when the notary says he was lucid enough to ask about insurance. He held up a second finger. 2. Undue influence is not just nagging. You have to prove that your sister exerted such dominance that she effectively replaced his free will with her own. That usually requires medical records, witness testimony, or a pattern of isolation. And 3, he said, dropping his hand, bad behavior is not illegal. Being a cruel sister is not a crime. Selling your mother's ring is heartless. But if the house was hers, the contents might be argued as hers too, unless you have a will that specifically lists personal property. So I can't do anything? I asked, feeling the familiar cold weight in my stomach. Mr. Henderson shook his head. I didn't say that. I said it is hard to overturn that deed. You need more than suspicious timing. You need a smoking gun. You need proof of fraud. You need to find a lie on a government document. You need to find a crack in the paperwork that breaks the seal of legality. He looked at my file. Keep digging. Lydia, you are organized. That is your advantage. Most people get emotional and sloppy. You're building a case. Find the lie. I left his office with a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't need to win a moral argument. I needed to find a lie. I went back to the money. The loan from Cedar Valley Lending, $50,000, secured against the house the day after my father died. I had searched for them before and found nothing but a post office box. Now, I dug deeper. I went to the Secretary of State's business entity search. I paid the $5 fee to download the articles of incorporation for Cedar Valley Lending. The registered agent was not a person. It was another company, Apex Corporate Services. I searched for Apex. It was a generic filing service, but the address for the principal office of Cedar Valley Lending was listed as a suite in an office park on the north side of the city, 400 Industrial Way, Suite 305. I took a Saturday morning to drive out there. The building was a sleek, glass and steel structure that looked out of place among the older warehouses. I walked into the lobby and looked at the directory. Suite 305 was not listed as Cedar Valley Lending. It was listed as Northline Development Group. I stood there, staring at the white lettering on the blackboard. Northline Development. I knew that name. They were the company behind the massive new condo complex downtown. The one that had gentrified 3 blocks in 2 years. They were known for aggressive acquisitions and quiet assembly of land parcels. Why would a major real estate developer be lending $50,000 to my sister? Through a shell company called Cedar Valley? They wouldn't, unless the loan wasn't a loan, unless it was a down payment. I went home and opened my laptop. I pulled up the city's planning commission website. If Northline was involved, they were building something. I searched the minutes of the planning meetings for the last year. It took me 4 hours of scrolling through PDF files of dry bureaucratic text about setbacks and drainage variances. My eyes burned. I drank 3 cups of coffee. Then I found it. A meeting agenda from 6 months ago. Agenda Item 4. Proposed rezoning of District 9 for Transit-Oriented Development Corridor. District 9 included my parents' street. I clicked on the map attachment. There was a thick red line drawn right down the center of the neighborhood. It was the proposed route for the light rail expansion, a project that had been rumored for years but never funded. But here it was, on paper, and right next to the proposed station stop, highlighted in yellow, was a block of 4 houses. My parents' house was one of them. I sat back in my chair, the breath leaving my lungs. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about the memories or the oak floors, or even the sibling rivalry. It was about the land. If that rezoning went through, and if North Lane was already assembling the properties, that house wasn't worth the $300,000 the tax assessor said it was. It was worth double that, maybe triple. Elena wasn't just stealing a house. She was securing a lottery ticket. The $50,000 loan was likely a signing bonus, a way to give her cash immediately to pay for the funeral and the expenses while they waited for the rezoning to be finalized. I felt a surge of nausea. She had sold our childhood home to a developer while our father was still breathing. She had used his dying days to close a business deal. I needed proof. The connection was strong, but it was circumstantial. I needed to show that she knew. 2 weeks later, the proof arrived in my mailbox. It was a plain white envelope, no return address. My name and address were typed on a label. I opened it standing by the recycling bins, expecting a late bill or a credit card offer. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. They were photocopies. The quality was grainy, like they had been copied on a machine running low on toner. But the text was legible. They were emails. The header on the top email read, "From E. Miller to S. Vance, Northline Dev." The date was September 20th. 3 weeks before my father died. Subject: Timeline. Steve, I understand the urgency regarding the assemblage. I am working on the title transfer now. My parents are agreeable, but their health is declining rapidly, so we need to move the deed up before any probate issues arise. Regarding the occupancy question, once the transfer is complete, I will handle the clearing of occupancy. There is a younger sister living nearby, but she has no legal claim. My sister won't make trouble if we keep it legal. I will ensure the property is vacant by November 1st. Best, Elena. I read the line again. My sister won't make trouble if we keep it legal. And, clearing occupancy. I wasn't a person to her. I wasn't a grieving sibling. I was an occupancy issue. I was debris that needed to be swept out so the deal could close. I flipped to the second page. It was a reply from Steve Vance. Elena, sounds good? We can structure the advance as a private loan to avoid triggering a sale reassessment tax just yet. We will paper it through Cedar Valley. Just make sure the deed is recorded before the passing. We need clean title. If it goes to probate, we are looking at a 6-month delay, and we can't wait that long for the zoning application. Make sure it's filed before he's gone. They discussed my father's death as a deadline for paperwork. I looked at the envelope again. Who sent this? Was it a disgruntled secretary at Northline? A paralegal who found the file and felt a pang of conscience? Or was it someone who wanted to sabotage Steve Vance? I realized it didn't matter. I couldn't trust the source. I couldn't walk into court and wave anonymous emails. The judge would throw them out as hearsay or unverified evidence, but I could use them. They were a map. The email mentioned clearing occupancy and keeping it legal. I went back to my timeline. What had Elena done to make the eviction look legal and necessary? She had given me a letter from a property management company citing safety concerns. I dug through my box of papers and found the original notice she had handed me on the porch. Due to safety concerns regarding the securing of the estate, if she claimed safety concerns, she had to document them. A developer like Northline wouldn't just take her word for it. They would want a paper trail showing the house was uninhabitable to justify the immediate vacancy. I went back to the city's code enforcement database. I searched the address. There it was. Inspection report 44-902. Date October 18th. 3 days after the funeral. Inspector R. Higgins. Findings: hazardous wiring in second-floor subpanel. Immediate vacancy recommended pending repairs. Hazardous wiring? My father was an electrician by trade. He had rewired that house himself 10 years ago. It was impeccable. I looked up R. Higgins. Robert Higgins, licensed city inspector. I found his work number in the city directory. I called him from the break room at the library, my heart hammering against my ribs. City inspections. Higgins speaking. Mr. Higgins, my name is Lydia Wood. I am calling about an inspection report filed under your name for a property on Elm Street. Date of October 18th. There was a pause. The sound of typing. Elm Street? I don't recall an Elm Street. What is the number? I gave it to him. He hummed. That is weird. I have the report here in the system. But, hang on. What? I asked. I was in Florida that week. He said, my daughter was getting married in Tampa. I was out from the 15th to the 22nd. I gripped the phone tighter. Are you sure? Lady, I paid $4,000 for the catering. I am sure. I didn't inspect any houses on October 18th. So how is your name on the report? I asked, my voice trembling. He was silent for a moment. Then his voice went hard. Someone must have used my credentials, or it is a forgery. Look, I don't know who you are, but I'm going to have to pull this file. If someone is signing my name, that is a felony. Thank you. Mr. Higgins. I said, thank you so much. I hung up. I had found the lie. She, or someone working with her, had forged a safety report to create a legal pretext for kicking me out. They needed me gone instantly so they could hand the vacant property over to the developer's control. And they couldn't wait for a standard eviction process, so they created a hazard. I felt a strange sense of calm. The gaslighting was over. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I was the victim of a calculated, multi-layered fraud. That afternoon, I had my weekly session with Dr. Evans. I told her everything, the developer, the emails, the forged inspection. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt sad. A deep, aching sadness that settled in my bones. Why does this surprise you? Lydia? Doctor. Evans asked gently. Because she is my sister. I said, because we shared a room. Because I thought she just wanted the money. But this? The emails. She talks about me like I am a pest. My sister won't make trouble. Lydia. Doctor, Evans said, leaning forward. You have spent your whole life being the person who doesn't make trouble. You were the peacekeeper, the caretaker, the one who absorbed the family's anxiety so no one else had to. Elena has always been the one who takes. You have always been the one who yields. This theft isn't an aberration. It is the logical conclusion of a dynamic that has existed for 30 years. You were cast as the lesser daughter a long time ago. The lesser daughter. The words stung, but they rang true. I had always deferred to Elena. I had always assumed she knew better. I had signed the papers at the funeral because I was trained to trust her authority over my own intuition. I am not the lesser daughter anymore. I said, then stop acting like a sister, Doctor, Evans said, and start acting like a plaintiff. She was right. I needed to formalize this. I needed to stop lurking in the shadows and force Elena to acknowledge me. I decided to try one last step before dropping the nuclear option of a lawsuit. I contacted the Community Dispute Resolution Center. It was a mediation service that offered a way to settle family disputes without court. I filed a request for mediation regarding the distribution of personal property and estate assets. To my surprise, Elena agreed. The center sent me a notification. Respondent Elena Miller has agreed to attend the mediation session scheduled for June 12th at 2 p.m. I spent a week preparing. I printed my timeline. I organized the photos of the auction items. I didn't bring the emails or the proof of the forgery. I was saving those. I just wanted to see if she would look me in the eye and offer a crumb of truth. If she would give me the family photos. If she would acknowledge that I existed. On June 12th, I sat in a conference room with a neutral mediator named Carol. The clock on the wall ticked. 2 o'clock came and went. 2:10, 2:20. Carol checked her phone. I haven't heard from her. Let me call. She stepped out. I sat alone in the room, staring at the empty chair across from me. I knew, with a sudden, sinking certainty, that she wasn't coming. She had never intended to come. Agreeing to the mediation was just a way to buy time, or to make herself look cooperative on paper in case a judge ever looked at the file. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Elena. Stop dragging strangers into our family business. You are embarrassing yourself. I am not coming. I stared at the screen. Embarrassing yourself. Carol came back in. She isn't answering. I am sorry. Lydia, we will have to mark this as a no-show. Can I get a record of that? I asked. Yes, she said. I will write up a certificate of non-compliance. It shows you tried to resolve this in good faith, and she refused. I drove home with the certificate on the passenger seat. The mediation had been a failure, but the certificate was a weapon. I called Mr. Henderson, my limited scope attorney. She no-showed the mediation. I said, and I have proof that the safety inspection used to evict me was forged. The inspector denies writing it. Mr. Henderson let out a low whistle. Okay, that changes things. That gives us cause. Cause for what? Cause to compel production. He said, we can file a petition demanding she turn over the entire probate file, including the inventory and any communications regarding the assets. If she refuses, she is in contempt. We are not asking to overturn the deed yet. We are just asking the court to force her to show her cards. Do it, I said. It took 3 weeks for the court order to be issued. Elena's lawyer, a high-priced shark named Mr. Sterling, tried to block it, calling it a fishing expedition by a disgruntled heir. But the judge, seeing the certificate of non-compliance and the affidavit from the inspector stating the report was questionable, granted the order. The personal representative is hereby ordered to produce a full and complete inventory of all estate assets, including all correspondence, deeds, and testamentary documents. Within 10 days, the box of documents arrived at Mr. Henderson's office on a rainy Tuesday. I went in to review it. We sat at his conference table, sifting through the stack. It was mostly financial fluff, bank statements, funeral receipts, but near the bottom, buried under a stack of medical bills, was a document titled Estate Inventory Schedule B. I ran my finger down the list. Item 1, 2018 Buick LaCrosse. Item 2, Household Furnishings, Liquidation Value. I scanned down to the bottom of the page. Item 7, Sealed Instrument / Separate Letter of Instruction. Status, held for later delivery per decedent's directive. Condition for delivery. Pending. I froze. What is this? I asked, pointing to item 7. Mr. Henderson squinted at it. A separate letter of instruction. It is not a will, but sometimes people leave private letters to be read after a certain time or event. Usually, it is sentimental. I love you. Be good to each other. That sort of thing. Held for later delivery. I read, condition for delivery. Pending. What condition? I asked. Mr. Henderson shrugged. The document doesn't say, but if it is listed in the inventory, it exists. And if it is listed as held, that means Elena has it. Or her lawyer has it. I thought of my mother. I thought of the last year of her life, when her mind was fading but her heart was still terrified of conflict. She knew Elena was dominating. She knew I was soft. Had she written something? Had she left a message in a bottle, hoping it would wash up on shore before Elena burned everything down? I want that letter. I said. Mr. Henderson nodded. Then we are going to have to fight for it, because if she hasn't given it to you yet, she is hiding it for a reason. I looked at the line again. Separate letter. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope that wasn't based on anger. It was based on connection. My parents hadn't just left me nothing. They had left me words, and Elena was holding them hostage. I closed the file. The investigation into the developer was crucial. The forged inspection was the weapon, but the letter was the heart, and I was going to tear the world apart to get it. 2 years is a deceptively long time. It is enough time for the human body to replace almost every cell it contains, and it is enough time for a person to convince herself that she has moved on. By the 2nd anniversary of my father's death, my life looked fine. I had been promoted to lead archivist at the library, which meant a small raise and a glass-walled office that smelled of lemon polish. I had moved out of the basement room into a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick building that got decent afternoon light. I bought a rug. I bought a coffee maker that cost more than $20. I had friends who invited me to dinner parties where we talked about politics and movies, and where I managed to laugh without feeling like I was performing a magic trick. But the house was still there. It was not a physical presence in my life. I had not driven down Elm Street in 18 months, but it was a bruise under the skin of my existence. It was a silence that sat at the center of every family holiday I spent alone. It was the knowledge that I had been erased. My sister, Elena, had not just taken a building, she had taken the geography of my history. She had curated a version of our family where I was a footnote, a liability that had been settled and removed. I told myself I was over it. I told my therapist, Dr. Evans, that I was focusing on the future, but I was lying. At night, the file box came out. The timeline on my wall had grown. The string connecting the pushpins weaving a web of calculated deceit that was so dense it made my head ache. I was not over it. I was just stuck. The stuck point was the letter. We had found the reference in the inventory list months ago. Item 7. Sealed instrument / separate letter of instruction. But finding a reference to a document is not the same as holding it. I had spent 6 months chasing that entry. I learned that the held for later delivery notation referred to a third-party custodian. Through a series of dogged emails and a few $100s in research fees paid to a private investigator, I discovered that the custodian was a firm called Guardian Trust Services. They were a boutique firm that handled what estate planners called dead hand control, mechanisms designed to exert influence from beyond the grave. I had petitioned the court to compel Elena to release the letter, arguing that as an heir, I had a right to know the terms of the estate. The response from Elena's attorney, Mr. Sterling, had been swift and brutal. He filed a motion to dismiss my petition, labeling it as harassment. In his brief, he argued that I was a disgruntled beneficiary engaging in a fishing expedition to delay the orderly administration of the estate. He claimed that the letter was subject to specific triggers, conditions that had not yet been met, and that releasing it prematurely would violate the privacy of the decedents. Triggers. I sat in Mr. Henderson's office, reading the motion. The rain was lashing against the window, blurring the city lights into gray smears. What kind of triggers? I asked. Mr. Henderson rubbed his eyes. He looked tired. We were 2 years into a fight that was supposed to be simple. Anything, he said. Time delays are common. Sometimes a letter is released 5 years after death. Sometimes it is released only if a beneficiary marries, or has a child, or, and this is the kicker, if a specific asset is sold, if the house is sold. I said, it is possible. He said, your mother might have wanted to ensure that if the house was sold, you got a say, or she might have wanted to explain why you didn't. But Elena is selling it. I said, she is selling it to Northline Development. She hasn't sold it yet. Mr. Henderson reminded me. She is holding it. The title is still in her name. The loan from Cedar Valley was just a loan. Until she actually transfers the deed to Northline, the trigger might not pull. I felt a surge of frustration so hot it made my hands shake. So we wait? We just wait until she sells it, and then I get a letter telling me I was right while the bulldozers are knocking it down? Mr. Henderson sighed. We can try to argue that the intent to sell is enough, but Sterling is good. He is dragging this out. He knows you don't have the war chest he does. Every motion costs money. Lydia, he is trying to bleed you dry. I went home that night and looked at my bank account. The emergency fund I had built was dwindling. Legal fees were eating my savings faster than I could replenish them. I was tired. I was so tired of being the plaintiff. But the next week, I found a thread I hadn't pulled yet. I was going through my mother's old tax returns, copies I had managed to get from the accountant who had prepared them for 20 years. A sweet old man who didn't know he wasn't supposed to talk to me. I noticed a recurring deduction. Oak Creek Community Foundation. $500 every year for 10 years. My parents had donated $500 to this local charity. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was consistent. I decided to visit the foundation. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe just a connection to the people my parents had been. The foundation was housed in a small Victorian house downtown. The receptionist was a woman in her 60s with bright silver hair and a scarf printed with cats. When I introduced myself as Mary Wood's daughter, her face lit up. "Oh, Mary!" she exclaimed. We missed her so much at the annual luncheons. She was such a lovely woman. I smiled, feeling a genuine warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. She loved this organization. I wanted to ask about their donations. I said, I am trying to organize their records. The woman, whose name was Mrs. Clark, waved a hand. Oh, they were steady as a clock. Every December, your mother always brought the check in person because she wanted to say hello. She paused, looking at me closely. You are Lydia, right? The younger one? Yes, I said. Your mother talked about you. Mrs. Clark said. She was so proud of you working at the library. She used to say, Lydia is the one with the soft heart. I felt a lump form in my throat. She said that? She did. Mrs. Clark leaned over the desk, her voice lowering conspiratorially. You know, the last time she was here, it must have been a few months before she passed. She seemed worried. She asked me about our endowment structure. She wanted to know how we kept families from fighting over named funds. Fighting? I asked. Yes, she said. I just want to protect both girls from conflict. I am afraid one of them is going to push too hard. She didn't say which one? I asked. Though I knew. Mrs. Clark shook her head. No. But she looked tired. She said she was setting up something to act as a buffer. She called it a safety valve. A safety valve. I thanked Mrs. Clark and walked out into the sunshine. My mother hadn't been oblivious. She had seen Elena's ambition. She had seen my passivity, and she had tried to build a structure to save us from ourselves. The safety valve had to be the letter, or the trust. I went back to the financial records with a new perspective. If my mother was trying to protect us, she wouldn't have agreed to a secret loan from a shell company. That wasn't her style. I pulled up the file on the lien. Cedar Valley Lending, $50,000, recorded October 16th. I had requested the payoff statement during the discovery phase of my petition. Elena had provided it, likely thinking it was innocuous. I looked at the date of the payoff. February 4th. The loan had been paid in full less than 4 months after it was taken out. I did the math. The interest rate listed on the note was 12%. It was a hard money loan, expensive and predatory, but Elena had paid it off almost immediately. Where did she get $50,000 plus interest in February? The estate account showed no major withdrawals. She hadn't sold the stocks yet. She hadn't sold the car. Then I saw it. A deposit into the estate account on February 2nd. Life insurance proceeds, $52,000. My father had a small life insurance policy. Elena had used the death benefit, money that was supposed to be shared or used for estate expenses, to pay off the loan she had taken out against the house she had stolen. It was a wash, a circle. She took the loan to get cash up front, maybe to pay off the notary or grease the wheels with the developer. And then she used Dad's death money to wipe the debt clean so the title would be clear for Northline. It was a paper mechanism. The loan wasn't about need. It was about encumbering the property so that if I did try to challenge the deed early on, I would be fighting a house with a lien on it. It was a defensive maneuver. She was playing chess. I had been playing checkers. But chess players leave patterns. I decided to stop looking at paper and start looking at people. Mrs. Clark had given me a piece of the puzzle. I needed more. I needed to understand how Elena had isolated them in those final months. I started making calls. I was careful. I didn't want to sound like I was investigating. I framed it as a memorial project, collecting stories about my parents. I met Mr. Henderson, not my lawyer, but my father's old supervisor from the utility company, at a diner. He was 80, with hands that shook when he held his coffee cup. Arthur was a good man, he said. Best foreman I ever had. We used to play poker every third Thursday. I didn't know that. I said, well, we stopped about 6 months before he passed. Mr. Henderson said, I called him a few times to see if he wanted to come, but your sister always answered. Elena? Yeah. She told me Arthur was embarrassed, said he was having accidents, said he didn't want to see his old buddies because he was ashamed of his condition. I stared at him. My father had physical issues, But he was proud. He would never have hidden from his friends. And he certainly wasn't incontinent 6 months out. That only happened in the last week. She told you that? I asked. She did, she said. It is better if you let him keep his dignity. So we stopped calling. We didn't want to upset him. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. She hadn't just stolen the house. She had stolen his friends. She had cut him off from his support system so that she was the only voice in his ear. I went to see Mrs. Higgins, a neighbor 3 doors down. I brought her a potted plant. We sat on her porch. I felt so bad I didn't visit more at the end. Mrs. Higgins said, wiping a tear, I tried to bring a casserole over in September, but Elena met me at the door. She said your mother was contagious. Contagious? I said, with dementia? She said it was a viral thing. Said the doctor ordered strict quarantine. No visitors. She wouldn't even let me step in the hallway. The pattern was undeniable. Isolation, control, gatekeeping. She had built a wall around them, brick by brick, lie by lie. By the time she put the deed in front of them, they must have felt completely alone in the world, dependent on her for every connection to the outside. I wrote it all down, the dignity lie, the quarantine lie. It wasn't hard evidence of fraud, but it was evidence of undue influence. It was proof that she had manipulated their reality. Then, the low point came. It arrived on a Friday afternoon. Via a courier who knocked on my apartment door, I signed for the envelope. It was heavy. On thick bond paper. Cease and desist. To Lydia Wood. You are hereby notified to cease and desist all harassment, defamation, and stalking behaviors directed at Elena Miller and the estate of Arthur and Mary Wood. Your continued contact with the decedent's former associates, neighbors, and financial institutions constitutes a tortious interference with the administration of the estate. Your spread of false narratives regarding the mental capacity of the decedents is defamatory. If you do not immediately cease these activities, we will pursue a restraining order and seek damages for emotional distress and legal fees. I sat on my floor, holding the letter, stalking. She called me a stalker because I talked to Dad's poker buddy. She called me defamatory because I asked a neighbor about a casserole. The unfairness of it crushed me. I was the one who had been locked out. I was the one who had been robbed. And now, I was the one being threatened with a restraining order. I curled up on the rug and cried. Not the polite, silent crying I had mastered, but ugly, heaving sobs that hurt my ribs. I wanted to stop. I really did. I looked at the timeline on the wall, the strings, the pushpins, the years of obsession, and I hated it. I hated who I had become. I was a detective of my own misery. I was spending my life looking backward at a crime that no one else seemed to care about. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was obsessed. Maybe I should just let her have it. Let her have the money, the house, the victory. At least then I could sleep. I called Sarah. I am done. I told her, I can't do this anymore. She is going to sue me. She is going to ruin me. Sarah came over. She brought wine and takeout. She sat on the floor with me and read the letter. This is scary, she admitted. It is designed to be scary. It worked. I said, I am scared. I am exhausted. I just want it to be over. Sarah poured me a glass of wine. She looked at the timeline on the wall. Lydia, she said softly, you can stop. You have permission to stop. No one will blame you. Thank you, I whispered. But, she added, you need to know what stopping means. I looked at her. It means peace. No, she said. It means silence. It means the story ends today. And the ending is that Elena was the devoted daughter who inherited the house, and you were the crazy sister who couldn't handle it. That is the history that gets written. If you can live with that, then stop. I stared at the cease and desist letter. False narratives. If I stopped, the lie became the truth, permanent, immutable. I thought about my father, embarrassed to see his friends because Elena told them he was ashamed. I thought of my mother, worried about protecting us, thinking she had set up a safety valve. not knowing Elena had welded it shut. Quitting wouldn't give me peace. It would just give me a different kind of haunting. I am not doing this for revenge, I said, realizing it for the first time. I am not doing it to hurt her. Then why? Sarah asked. Accountability. I said, I just want the truth to be on the record. Even if I lose the house, even if the judge rules against me. I want it written down somewhere, in a court file, that she lied. Then you can't stop. Sarah said. I took a deep breath. Okay, I won't stop. But time was running out. 2 days later, I saw the news. I was scrolling through the local paper's website when the headline jumped out at me. Federal infrastructure grant approved for Northline Transit Corridor. Construction to begin 6 months early. I clicked the article. My heart hammered against my ribs. The grant money had come through. The city was fast-tracking the zoning changes. The 5-year plan had collapsed into a 6-month sprint. The article quoted Steve Vance, the developer. We are excited to break ground. We have acquired 90% of the necessary parcels and are moving to close on the final properties this quarter. This quarter. That meant now. If Elena transferred the house to Northline, it would be gone. Once it was sold to a third party, especially a bona fide purchaser like a developer who could claim they didn't know about the family dispute, it would be almost impossible to get back. The court wouldn't unwind a multi-million-dollar development deal just because two sisters were fighting. The asset would be converted to cash. The house would be demolished, and the evidence would be buried under concrete. I realized then that my methodical, paper-by-paper approach was too slow. I had been building a case for a trial that might happen in a year, but the house didn't have a year. It had weeks. Time was the enemy. I called Mr. Henderson. Did you see the news? I asked. I did. He said, we have a problem. She's going to sell. I said, she has to. The developer is pushing. If she sells. Mr. Henderson said, the triggers for the letter might activate, but the house will be gone. You will be fighting over a pile of money, not the property. I don't want the money. I said, I want the house. I want to stop her from erasing us. Then we have to stop the sale. He said, how? We have to file for an emergency injunction, a temporary restraining order. We have to go before a judge and argue that the sale will cause irreparable harm. But you said we needed a smoking gun. I said, do we have it? He paused. We have a lot of smoke. Lydia, the forged inspection, the rapid lien payoff, the isolation of the parents, the notary irregularities. It is circumstantial. But if we weave it together tight enough, it might be enough to get a judge to hit the pause button. And if we lose? I asked. If we lose the motion, he said, she sells the house the next day, and she will likely sue you for legal fees for interfering with the deal. It was an all-in bet. If I filed the emergency motion, I was forcing a confrontation. I would have to stand up in open court and accuse my sister of fraud. I would have to lay out every ugly detail of our family's collapse. And if I failed, I would be bankrupt and homeless, and she would be rich. I looked around my apartment. It was safe. It was quiet. But it wasn't home. File it, I said. Are you sure? Mr. Henderson asked. This is the point of no return. I looked at the cease and desist letter on my desk. I picked it up and crumpled it into a ball. She wants me to cease, I said. I am going to do the opposite. I am going to get loud. File the motion. Mr. Henderson, I am ready to burn the bridge. I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from adrenaline. The long, slow simmer of the last 2 years was over. The investigation was done. It was time to go to war. The legal document that officially turned my grief into a war was 32 pages long. It was titled, Petition to Quiet Title and Void Deed for Fraud and Undue Influence. I sat in Mr. Henderson's office and read it before he filed it. It was devoid of adjectives. There were no words like cruel or heartless or betrayal. Instead, it was a cold, mathematical dismantling of the last 2 years of my sister's life. Count 1. Fraudulent inducement. It detailed the notary's admission that my parents believed they were signing insurance paperwork. Count 2. Abuse of fiduciary duty. It listed the isolation of the decedents, the screening of calls, and the control of medical appointments. Count 3. Constructive fraud. It attached the forged safety inspection report and the eviction notice, arguing that these documents were created to illegally bypass tenant protection laws. It felt surgical. It felt necessary. File it, I said, handing the draft back to Mr. Henderson. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. Once this is docketed, it is public record. Lydia. The clock starts ticking. She has 20 days to answer. I hope she reads every word. I said, we filed on a Thursday. By Monday, the response arrived. It wasn't a legal filing. It was a phone call. I was at work, cataloging a donation of local history books, when Mr. Henderson called my cell. We have an offer. He said, already? I asked. She hasn't even filed a response. Mr. Sterling called me this morning. Mr. Henderson said. His voice was neutral. The professional detachment of a man who has seen everything. They want to settle. They want this to go away before it hits the discovery phase. What is the offer? I asked. $250,000. He said. I stopped breathing for a second. $250,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was enough to pay off my student loans, buy a small house, and pad my retirement account. It was a life-changing amount of money. And? I asked, sensing the but hanging in the air. And you sign a global release, he said. You drop the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning you can never refile. You acknowledge the validity of the deed. And you sign a non-disclosure agreement. You can never speak about the estate, the eviction, or the terms of the settlement to anyone, not a soul. If you do, you forfeit the money and pay a penalty. I sat down on a step stool in the stacks. She wants to buy my silence. I said, she wants to buy clean title. Mr. Henderson corrected. She can't sell to the developer with a lis pendens, a lawsuit notice, attached to the property. She needs you gone, Lydia, and she is willing to pay $250,000 to make you disappear. I thought about the money. I thought about the freedom it would buy. No more renting, no more worrying about the grocery bill. I could walk away. I could tell myself that I won, that I forced her to pay. But then I thought about the confidentiality clause. You acknowledge the validity of the deed. I would have to sign a paper saying she was right. I would have to agree, legally, that she hadn't stolen the house. I would have to agree that my father wasn't manipulated, that the inspection wasn't forged, that I wasn't locked out. I would have to participate in the lie. It felt like a second eviction. The first time, she kicked me out of the house. This time, she was trying to kick me out of the truth. Tell her no. I said, Lydia. Mr. Henderson said softly, think about it. This is a guaranteed win. Trial is a gamble. It is not a win if I have to lie. I said, I want the house back in the estate. I want it distributed according to the will, 50-50, or I want a judge to say she stole it. I don't want her hush money. There was a long pause. Then I heard the smile in his voice. I will draft the rejection, he said. Rejecting the money felt like jumping off a cliff. But it also clarified things. I wasn't doing this for profit. I was doing this for history. And because I had rejected the settlement, I dug deeper. I went back to the document that started it all, the eviction notice. Vantage Estate Services, I had assumed, back in the beginning, that it was just a fake name she slapped on a letterhead. But Mr. Henderson had taught me that fraudsters often try to add a veneer of legitimacy by actually filing paperwork. I went to the Secretary of State's business registry. I searched for Vantage Estate Services. I found it. It was a limited liability company. But it wasn't formed by Elena Miller. It was formed by a registered agent. I paid the $10 to download the articles of organization. I looked at the organizer's signature. Jessica T. Davis. I knew that name. Jessica Davis was Elena's college roommate. They had been bridesmaids in each other's weddings. But it was the date that made the air leave the room. Date of formation, September 28th. My father died on October 15th. Elena had formed the company to evict me 2 weeks before our father died. She hadn't just reacted to his death with greed. She had been sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, while simultaneously texting her best friend to set up the shell company that would throw me onto the street. She had looked at me across the dinner table, knowing she had a loaded gun in her pocket, waiting for his heart to stop so she could pull the trigger. It was premeditated malice. I added the document to the pile. The timeline on my wall was no longer just a theory. It was a blueprint of a conspiracy. But I needed to see her. I needed to see the partnership she had chosen over me. The city council was holding a public hearing on the rezoning of the North Line transit corridor. It was the final step before the project was fully approved. I took the afternoon off and sat in the back of the council chambers. The room was packed with people, concerned neighbors, union workers hoping for jobs, and the slick, well-dressed team from Northline Development. And there she was. Elena sat in the second row, right behind Steve Vance, the developer. She wasn't wearing black. She was wearing a tailored navy suit. She had a notebook open on her lap. She leaned forward, whispering something to one of the Northline attorneys, and he nodded, smiling at her. She looked important. She looked like she belonged there. I realized then that the house wasn't a home to her anymore. It wasn't the place where we measured our height on the doorframe. It was a unit, a parcel, an asset on a spreadsheet that she had successfully leveraged to get a seat at the big table. She wasn't grieving. She was networking. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a cold, hard resolve. She had traded our parents for a development deal. She had traded me for a seat in the second row. I left before the hearing ended. I didn't want her to see me. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had the last piece of the puzzle. The last piece came from a direction I didn't expect. 3 days after we rejected the settlement, Mr. Henderson called me. "You need to come in," he said. "We have a witness." I drove to his office in the rain. Sitting in the conference room was a young woman, maybe 25, looking nervous. She was twisting a paper coffee cup in her hands. "Lydia, this is Chloe." "Mr. Henderson said. Chloe used to work for Northline Development. Chloe looked up at me. Her eyes were rimmed with red. "I saw the news about the lawsuit," she said quietly. "A friend of mine still works there and told me about the petition you filed." When I saw the name, Miller, I knew I had to say something. "What do you know?" I asked, sitting down across from her. I was Steve Vance's executive assistant until 3 months ago. She said, "I handled his calendar and his emails. I remember your sister." "You do?" Chloe nodded. "She came in a lot, last fall, before your dad died." "What did they talk about?" I asked. Chloe took a deep breath. Steve was pressuring her. The assemblage for the project was falling behind schedule. He told her he needed the deed for the corner lot, your parents' house, locked down by November 1st, or he was going to cut the offer price. And what did Elena say? "She said she could handle it," Chloe said, but Steve was worried about the title. He kept saying, "I need clean title." "Elena, no probate mess, no heirs popping up." Chloe paused, looking down at her cup. "And," I prompted, and she told him not to worry. Chloe whispered. She said, "I am getting them to sign a deed next week, and I have a plan for the occupancy removal." "Occupancy removal," I repeated, the phrase from the anonymous email. She specifically used those words? "Mr. Henderson asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. "Yes," Chloe said. "I remember because it sounded so cold." She wasn't talking about a tenant. She was talking about her sister. She said, "My sister is the only hurdle, but I will have her out before the funeral flowers wilt." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Before the flowers wilt. Can you swear to this?" Mr. Henderson asked. "In an affidavit?" Chloe looked at me. I was fired because I refused to backdate a document for Steve. She said, "I hate what they do. I hate how they treat people." "Yes, I will sign it." We drafted the affidavit right there. It was the smoking gun. It linked the developer's pressure directly to Elena's timeline. It proved that the deed and the eviction were part of a single, coordinated commercial transaction. But the biggest blow was yet to come. The filing of our lawsuit had triggered something else. The court clerk had flagged the petition to void deed, and sent a notice to all interested parties listed in the estate file. One of those parties was Guardian Trust Services. Apparently, the trigger for the sealed letter wasn't just time or sale, it was litigation. My mother had included a clause. If any legal action is commenced regarding the ownership of the family residence, this letter shall be released to the court and the beneficiaries immediately. It was the safety valve. She knew that if we were in court, the worst had already happened. The package arrived at Mr. Henderson's office via certified mail. Mr. Henderson handed it to me. It was unopened. I stared at the envelope. It was my mother's handwriting. To my girls. I opened it with trembling fingers. The letter was dated August 14th, 2 months before she died. My dearest Elena and Lydia, if you are reading this, it means I have failed. It means that despite my prayers, the fear that has kept me awake at night has come true, and you are fighting over the house. I am writing this because I feel the walls closing in. My memory is going, and I know I don't have much time left to be myself. I also know that Elena is worried about the house. She talks to me about protecting assets and trusts, and while I know she thinks she is helping, I feel her intensity. I feel like she is waiting for me to get out of the way. Lydia, I know you will be the one to care for us. You have always been the heart of this family, but I worry you are too soft for the world, and I worry Elena will steamroll over you because she thinks she knows best. So, I have done something that I hope I never have to use. I have signed a separate trust agreement today, creating the Wood Family Trust. This trust names both of you as equal beneficiaries. The house is intended to be the primary asset of this trust. However, I know Elena might try to have me sign something else. She brings papers. I get confused. So, I have instructed my attorney to hold this trust agreement and this letter. If a deed is recorded transferring the house to anyone other than this trust, this letter is your proof that such a deed was contrary to my true intent. I did not choose one of you. I chose both of you. The house is to be sold, and the proceeds split 50-50, if Elena has taken title. She has done so against my wishes. Please, forgive each other. I love you both. Mom. I put the letter down on the desk. I was crying. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. She hadn't chosen Elena. She hadn't abandoned me. She had seen exactly what was happening. Even through the fog of her dementia, she had known Elena was bringing papers. She had known she might be tricked or coerced, so she had created a failsafe. The letter was a legal grenade. It stated, in her own hand, that any deed transferring the house to Elena alone was invalid and contrary to her intent. It destroyed Elena's defense that, Mom wanted me to have it. We have her, I whispered. This letter voids the deed. It proves lack of intent. Mr. Henderson was reading the legal attachment to the letter. This is a constructive trust declaration, he said, his voice excited. She declares that any property held by one child is held in trust for the other. Lydia, this is brilliant. Your mother was smarter than anyone gave her credit for. But there was a catch. The letter had been released because I filed the lawsuit. The safeguard only worked because I had been brave enough to challenge Elena. If I had accepted the settlement, if I had signed the silence clause, this letter would have remained sealed forever. My mother hadn't underestimated Elena. She had underestimated me. She had worried I was too soft. But I had proven her wrong. We need to file this immediately. Mr. Henderson said, we need to get this into the record before the hearing. But Elena had one move left. The next morning, I got a frantic call from Mr. Henderson. She is trying to close. He said, What? We just got a notification from the title company. Northline Development has scheduled an expedited closing for Friday. She is signing the house over. She must know the letter is out. She is trying to sell the asset to a bona fide purchaser before the judge can rule on the letter. If she sold it to Northline, and Northline claimed they didn't know about the letter, they could keep the house. I would be left chasing Elena for the money, which she could hide or spend, the house, the physical evidence, the land, the legacy, would be gone. She is trying to outrun the truth. I said, we have to stop her. Mr. Henderson said, I am filing an ex parte emergency motion for a temporary restraining order. We are asking the judge to freeze the title immediately. When is the hearing? Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, he said. And Lydia? You have to be there. And you have to testify. Me? Yes. The judge will want to hear from the plaintiff. You have to explain why the harm is irreparable. You have to explain why money isn't enough. You have to tell the story of the eviction. I hung up the phone. My hands were cold. Tomorrow. I had spent 2 years hiding in the paperwork. I had built a fortress of documents to protect myself from the emotional reality of what my sister had done. I had let Mr. Henderson do the talking. I had let the affidavits do the accusing. But now, there was no paper left to hide behind. I had to walk into a courtroom, stand 5 feet away from the sister who had changed the locks on me, and tell a room full of strangers that my family was broken. I went to my closet. I pulled out the black dress I had worn to the funeral. I looked at it. It still smelled faintly of lilies and that terrible, cloying air freshener from the funeral home. I put it back. I wasn't the victim anymore. I pulled out a gray blazer, sharp, clean. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked older than I had 2 years ago. There were fine lines around my eyes. My mouth was set in a firmer line. I wasn't the lesser daughter. I wasn't the occupancy issue. I was the safeguard. My mother had left the door unlocked, but I was the one who had to walk through it. I sat down at my desk and took out a fresh legal pad. I didn't write a script. I wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Intent, betrayal, home. I closed my eyes. I could see the house. I could see the porch where she handed me the notice. I could see the boxes. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to perform. I wasn't going to be the hysterical woman Mr. Sterling wanted to paint me as. I was going to be the witness. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the city sounds, waiting for the sun to rise on the day that would decide everything. The war wasn't over, but the final battle was here, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of my sister. I was ready to speak. The Superior Court of the county is a building designed to make you feel small. The ceilings are too high, the marble is too cold, and the echoes of footsteps sound like gunshots in a canyon. I walked through the metal detector at 8:30 in the morning, my purse sliding through the X-ray machine, and felt a tremor in my hands that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I was not afraid of Elena. That fear had burned off somewhere between the forged inspection report and the cease and desist letter. What I felt was the crushing weight of exposure. For 2 years, I had held this story inside the tight, safe confines of my own skull. I had whispered it to my therapist and showed pieces of it to my lawyer, but I had never said it out loud to the world. Today, I had to open my mouth and let the ugly, broken truth of my family spill out onto the public record. I met Mr. Henderson outside Department 4. He looked calm, wearing a suit that was slightly better than his usual office attire. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No," I said, "but let's go." We walked in. The courtroom was already half full with other cases, divorces, probates, the endless catalog of human misery, but in the front row, on the right side, sat the phalanx. Elena was there. She was wearing a gray suit today, modest and sharp. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun. Next to her was Mr. Sterling, her attorney, a man who looked like he cost $600 an hour, and next to him was a younger associate, typing furiously on a laptop. They looked like a corporation. I looked like a woman who had taken a personal day from the library. When the bailiff called our case, Wood versus Miller, in re, emergency motion for temporary restraining order, the air in the room seemed to change. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Patterson with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, looked down at the file. "Counsel, state your appearances," she said. "Mr." Sterling stood up first. His voice was rich, a baritone practiced in country clubs. "Jonathan Sterling for the respondent, Elena Miller, and the estate. Robert Henderson for the petitioner, Lydia Wood," my lawyer said. Judge Patterson peered over her glasses. "I have read the motion. You are asking me to halt a sale that is scheduled to close tomorrow. That is an extreme remedy. Mr. Henderson, the bar is high. We are aware. Your Honor. Mr. Henderson said, but the harm is irreparable. If this property is sold to a third party, the primary asset of the estate, and the subject of a pending fraud claim, is gone forever. Mr. Sterling stood up. Your Honor, if I may, this motion is nothing more than a desperate, last-minute attempt by a disgruntled beneficiary to sabotage the orderly administration of her parents' estate. He turned slightly, gesturing toward me without looking at me. Ms. Wood has been estranged from the family dynamic for years. She is grieving, and we have great sympathy for that. But she has turned her grief into an obsession. She is rewriting history because she is resentful that her parents chose her sister to manage their affairs. She calls it fraud. The law calls it estate planning. There is no emergency here, other than the one Ms. Wood has manufactured in her own mind to get attention. I sat there, staring at the table, forcing myself to breathe, unstable, obsessed, resentful. He was painting a picture of a hysterical younger sister, a woman who couldn't handle reality. It was a smart strategy. It played into every stereotype of family drama. If I reacted, if I cried, or shook my head, or looked angry, I would prove him right. So I became a statue. I focused on the grain of the wood table. I focused on the fact that I knew the truth, even if he was paid to obscure it. Mr. Henderson didn't take the bait. He didn't argue about my feelings. He stood up and walked to the podium with a stack of papers. Your Honor, Mr. Sterling wants to talk about emotions. I want to talk about dates. He placed a large board on an easel facing the judge. It was my timeline, the one I had built on my bedroom wall, blown up to professional size. This is not a story about sibling rivalry. Mr. Henderson said, this is a story about a business plan. He pointed to the first date, September 28th. The respondent forms a limited liability company called Vantage Estate Services using a friend's address. This is 2 weeks before the father dies. He moved his finger. October 15th. The father passes away. October 17th. The respondent, using the name of the company she formed in secret, issues an eviction notice to the petitioner, citing safety concerns. October 18th. A safety inspection report is filed with the city. Condemning the electrical system, we have a sworn affidavit from the inspector, Mr. Higgins, stating he was in Florida at a wedding on that date and never visited the property. The report is a forgery. The courtroom went quiet. The word forgery hung in the air like smoke. October 20th. The respondent exchanges emails with the developer, Northline, promising to clear occupancy by November 1st. She refers to her sister not as an heir, but as an obstacle to be removed. Mr. Henderson turned to the judge. This wasn't estate planning. Your Honor, this was a liquidation. The respondent didn't evict her sister because the house was unsafe. She evicted her because she had already promised vacant possession to a developer before her father was even in the ground. The intent was not to manage the estate. The intent was to strip the estate of its value before the other beneficiary could ask questions. Judge Patterson looked at the timeline. She looked at Mr. Sterling, counsel. Do you have a response to the affidavit regarding the inspection report? Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. Your Honor, we are looking into that. It may be a clerical error, but it is irrelevant to the validity of the deed. The parents signed the deed. That is the controlling document. We challenge the deed as well. Mr. Henderson said, and to speak to that, I call the petitioner, Lydia Wood. I stood up. My legs felt like wood. I walked to the witness stand, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the truth. I sat down. The microphone was right in front of my face. Ms. Wood, Mr. Henderson said, why are you here today? I looked at Elena. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw set in a hard line. I am here because my mother asked me to be. I said, objection. Mr. Sterling said, hearsay, overruled. The judge said, let her speak. Mr. Henderson handed me the sealed letter. Mrs. Wood, can you identify this document? It is a letter from my mother, Mary Wood. I said, it was held in trust by Guardian Services and released to me 3 days ago. Please read the highlighted section. I took the paper. My hands were shaking, but I held them against the wood of the stand to steady them. I looked at my mother's handwriting, the loop of the L in Lydia, the slight tremor in the ink. I am writing this because I feel the walls closing in. I read. My voice was small, so I leaned closer to the mic. I know I don't have much time left to be myself. I also know that Elena is worried about the house. She talks to me about protecting assets, and while I know she thinks she is helping, I feel her intensity. I feel like she is waiting for me to get out of the way. I paused. I heard a sniffle from the gallery. I have instructed my attorney to hold this letter. I continued. If a deed is recorded transferring the house to anyone other than the trust, this letter is your proof that such a deed was contrary to my true intent. I did not choose one of you. I chose both of you. I looked up. The judge was looking at me. She wasn't looking at me like I was a plaintiff anymore. She was looking at me like a daughter. Mr. Sterling stood up to cross-examine me. Ms. Wood, he said, his voice softer now. Dangerous. Your mother had dementia, correct? Yes, I said. So she was confused? She might have written that letter in a moment of paranoia? She wasn't paranoid. I said clearly. She was right. Mr. Sterling smiled thinly. But you have no proof that your sister coerced your parents. Do you? You just have a letter from a confused woman and a timeline you created. You weren't in the room when the deed was signed. Were you? No. I said, so you don't know what happened in that room? No. I said, but I know who does. I stepped down. Mr. Henderson stood up. Your Honor, we have one final witness. We call Timothy Clark. A murmur went through the room. Elena's head snapped toward the door. She clearly hadn't expected this. Timothy Clark walked in. He was the guy from the shipping store. He looked uncomfortable, wearing a polo shirt and khakis. He looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. He was sworn in. Mr. Clark, Mr. Henderson asked, do you recognize the document marked Exhibit A? Timothy looked at the deed. Yeah, I notarized it. Do you remember the people who signed it? Yeah, Timothy said. I remember them because the daughter was assertive. Can you describe the process? Well, the old folks, Mr. and Mrs. Wood, they were pretty out of it. Timothy said. The old man was in a wheelchair. The lady was just staring at the floor. The daughter. She had the papers all clipped together. She put them down and flipped the pages. She pointed and said, sign here. Dad, sign here. Mom, did Mr. Wood ask any questions? Yeah, Timothy said. He asked if this was for the life insurance. And what did the daughter say? She said yes. She said, yes, it is for the insurance. Just sign it so we can go. Mr. Sterling jumped up. Objection. This contradicts the written notarization. The judge slammed her gavel. Sit down. Counsel. Mr. Henderson looked at Timothy. Did Mrs. Wood say anything? No, Timothy said. She didn't say a word. The daughter put the pen in her hand and guided it to the paper. Guided it? Mr. Henderson asked. You mean she physically moved her hand? Yeah. She held her wrist. The room went dead silent. That was it. That was the crack in the dam. If Elena had physically guided the hand, and if she had lied about the nature of the document, the deed wasn't just suspicious. It was void. Thank you, Mr. Henderson said. Judge Patterson didn't wait for closing arguments. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She looked at Elena, who was now staring at the table, her face pale. I have heard enough to issue a ruling on the emergency motion, the judge said. She picked up her pen. The testimony regarding the execution of this deed is deeply troubling. The discrepancy regarding the inspection report is deeply troubling. The timeline presented by the petitioner suggests a concerted effort to transfer assets outside the probate process under false pretenses. She looked at Mr. Sterling. The temporary restraining order is granted. The sale to Northline Development is enjoined. No transfer of title may occur until a full trial on the merits of the fraud claim can be heard. I am also ordering a forensic accounting of all estate assets and appointing a neutral administrator to take over the property immediately. Ms. Miller is removed as personal representative pending the outcome of this case. She slammed the gavel. We are adjourned. I sat there. I should have felt triumphant. I had won. I had stopped the sale. I had stripped Elena of her power. But I just felt hollow. I looked at my hands. They were still shaking. Winning a procedural step didn't undo the last 2 years. It didn't bring my parents back. It didn't erase the memory of the lock clicking shut. It just meant that the house would sit empty for another year while lawyers argued over the bones. Mr. Henderson squeezed my shoulder. Good job. Lydia. You did it. I nodded. Thank you. I walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was crowded with people from the next session, but the air felt thinner, cleaner. Lydia. I stopped. I knew the voice. I turned around. Elena was standing by the water fountain. Mr. Sterling was down the hall, talking to the Northline lawyers, who looked furious. Elena was alone. She looked smaller than she had in the courtroom. The composure was gone, replaced by a jagged, raw anger. Are you happy? She asked. Her voice was low. A hiss. You ruined the deal. Northline is going to walk. Good, I said. You don't understand, she said, stepping closer. The money. The market is peaking. We could have gotten 7 figures. Now it is just a house. An old, rotting house. It is our house. I said, it is just wood and brick, she snapped. Why do you care so much? You were never there. I stared at her. I was there every weekend. I was there for every holiday. I was the one who stayed, she whispered furiously. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a second, I saw the sister I used to know. I was the one who lived 10 minutes away. I was the one who got the calls at midnight when Dad fell. I was the one who dealt with the doctors, the diapers, the madness. You got to be the visiting angel. You came in, drank tea, and left. I stayed. She poked a finger at her own chest. I gave up my life for them those last 2 years. My marriage suffered. My job suffered. I did everything. And you think you deserve half? Because you share DNA? She was shaking now. I earned that house. Lydia, I paid for it with my sanity. Was I supposed to get nothing? Was I supposed to just split it with you like none of that work mattered? I looked at her. I saw her exhaustion. I saw the bitterness that had been festering for years, the narrative she had built to justify the theft. She truly believed that her caregiving gave her the right to plunder. She believed that love was a transaction, and she had paid more, so she deserved the receipt. I felt a surge of pity, but it was distant, like looking at a stranger through a telescope. Elena, I said softly. She stopped, breathing hard. You weren't supposed to get nothing. I said. I looked her in the eye. But you weren't supposed to get everything. I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked toward the elevators. It wasn't a victory line. It wasn't a mic drop. It was just a fact. It was the boundary line that I should have drawn 5 years ago. I walked out into the bright sunshine of the city. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Henderson. Northline just issued a statement. They are withdrawing the offer. The deal is dead. I put the phone in my pocket. The house was safe, for now. But as I walked to my car, I knew that the fight wasn't really over. Mr. Sterling would appeal. There would be depositions. There would be more legal bills. And even if I won the trial, the house would eventually have to be sold to pay the costs. Mr. Henderson had told me that there was another buyer interested. A private equity firm that bought distressed estates. The sharks were always circling. I stood on the corner, waiting for the light to change. I had to make a decision. I could keep fighting to keep the house in the family, to move back in and try to recreate a past that was already gone, or I could let the neutral administrator sell it, take my half of the money, and walk away. I thought about the timeline on my wall. I thought about the notarized deed. I thought about the letter from my mother. I realized then that I didn't need the house, I didn't need the physical structure. I had what I came for. I had the truth. It was on the record. It was in the transcript. The lie had been dismantled. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of exhaust and rain. It smelled like the future. I crossed the street. I wasn't going back to the house on Elm Street. I was going to my apartment. I was going to take the timeline down from the wall. I was going to put the pushpins in a drawer. And then, for the first time in 5 years, I was going to sleep. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It has been a long, difficult journey from that locked door to the courtroom, and sharing it with you has been part of my healing. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and tell me which country or city you call home. It helps me feel less alone to know this story is reaching people all over the world. If you want to hear more stories about people fighting back against injustice and reclaiming their truth, please make sure to subscribe to Revenge Stories. And finally, I'd love to hear your thoughts in English in the comments. Do you think I made the right choice? Should I have taken the settlement, or was the truth worth the cost? Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, always read the paperwork.